In May of 2021, Lucasfilm released the first episode of their brand new animated TV show called Star Wars: The Bad Batch. The series begins at the end of the Clone Wars, a 3-year galactic conflict between the Republic, whose army consisted of the Jedi Order leading clone soldiers, and the Separatists, who fought with battle droids sometimes led by powerful Sith. The conflict, which was ultimately just a ploy for the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, also known as Chancellor Palpatine, to turn the Republic into his galactic empire, ends with the tragedy known as Order 66, where the clones were ordered to execute all Jedi. Why would they obey? Well, every clone in the army unknowingly has a behavioral inhibitor chip implanted in their brain that essentially serves as a very powerful mind control device.
Good soldiers follow orders. Good soldiers follow orders.
Enter Clone Force 99, more colloquially called the Bad Batch. They were a group of 5 enhanced clones, 4 genetically modified to heighten specific skills desirable in a soldier, plus 1 with extensive cybernetic implants. Lucky for them, because of their modifications, the inhibitor chips didn't function in any of them.
What's Order 66?
Save for one, Crosshair.
Good soldiers follow orders.
His worked just fine. This led to the already cold and often cruel marksman leaving his squad behind in favor of the new Empire. He served as a major antagonist for the rest of the season, trying to hunt down the Batch for desertion and treason. Then, in the finale, there was an utterly unexpected twist.
It's your inhibitor chip. We can help you.
Wrong. I had my chip removed.
Crosshair was acting entirely of his own free will for at least part of the series. How much remains unclear. This sparked a fascinating phenomena among fans of the series. People were forgiving Crosshair's actions. Not just liking his character, no, people were utterly convinced that Crosshair was a genuinely good person. And let's be clear on one thing, that's definitely not true. He was fascist, supremacist, narcissistic.
We're superior.
And he committed many horrific crimes.
But I wouldn't tell you if I did.
Finish the mission. Aim for the kid.
Yet, it's a very tempting idea to fall into. Even I instinctually jumped to justifying his behavior when I first finished the series. It's not like Crosshair is the first villain to ever receive this treatment, so why? Why do people want to forgive characters that are objectively in the wrong? Why are there Crosshair apologists? Practically all of the varied excuses for Crosshair's actions fall under at least one of the 8 mechanisms of what's known as moral disengagement. The theory, coined by Albert Bandura, states that the worst of all punishments is the guilt and subsequent self-flagellation inspired by committing an act one considers amoral. Thus, if a person can convince themselves that an act is actually plenty moral, they can maintain their perceived self-image and escape the consequential pain. It's a defense mechanism. The methods through which this is done are classified into 4 stages. The justification locus, where one convinces themselves their action is just, the agency locus, where perpetrators evade responsibility for their actions, the outcome locus, where they dismiss the effects of their actions, and the victim locus, where they de-victimize those affected by their actions. There are 8 primary mechanisms of moral disengagement, several of which Crosshair himself uses. For example, he dehumanizes victims through his superiority complex. We see more of these mechanisms employed in the fans' case for Crosshair. The argument that he's being controlled or just following orders is a displacement of responsibility, pushing blame onto Crosshair's commanding officers. Crosshair uses this mechanism several times as well.
We didn't have a choice.
And I did.
Claims that the Empire is good and thus Crosshair is right, that he's acting for the righteous cause of order and justice, are a form of moral justification, where one essentially argues that an action is a necessary evil. Excusing Crosshair's actions as merely a result of his personal pain is an attribution of blame, different from the displacement of responsibility in that it places the blame on the victims of his actions, in this case, the Bad Batch themselves. Whatever mechanism or combination thereof a person uses is ultimately irrelevant, as the end outcome is the same. The person is convinced on some level that Crosshair's actions aren't amoral. They've morally disengaged. But since moral disengagement serves to alleviate guilt, that begs the question of why a person would feel guilty over the actions of a fictional character. Jessica E. Black shows in her paper that there is an inverse relationship between the liking of what the paper calls dark fictional characters, a category Crosshair firmly falls into, and imaginative resistance. Imaginative resistance is a person's inability to engage cognitively and emotionally with fiction that breaks the rules of life, in this case, the moral principles the person believes in. Typically, those with less imaginative resistance perform more moral disengagement. They're more able to accept amoral fiction. Thus, there is a correlation between a person's tendency to morally disengage and their liking of dark fictional characters like Crosshair. It is there that we find the reasons for morally disengaging. It feels wrong to like someone who does amoral things, worse yet, someone who is amoral. Furthermore, as explored in John Martin Chernev's dissertation, while there is no clear causative link between liking and identification, the two certainly have a strong dynamic relationship and tend to come hand in hand. They are theorized to be merely two aspects of a broader understanding and processing of a narrative. Thus, the relationship is even more sensical. If one sees oneself in a character and sees that character do wrong, it is logical to morally disengage to avoid the guilt of seeing yourself reflected in a character's amoral actions. But then, why are people liking or identifying with a villain? One of the major factors, as Chernev concludes, is the establishment of an external and internal goal. Crosshair's external goal, originally to kill but later to capture the Bad Batch, is a fairly unrelatable one, but his internal goals are the ones that likely spark identification. Above all else, Crosshair spends the season searching for belonging. He desperately wants to be important to someone, anyone, even if that someone is the evil Empire.
Not the ones that matter.
We watch throughout the season as the people around him fail to meet this need. Although done for good reason, the Bad Batch, his brothers, entirely abandon him.
You weren't loyal to me.
Which is an especially big deal because Star Wars as an expanded universe has firmly established just how wrong that is to the clones as a culture group.
We're shoulder to shoulder on those front lines. Brothers! You left a man behind. You broke rule number 1.
Loyalty means everything to the clones.
It is just as important to the Batch, despite their nature, as the exceptions.
They don't leave their own behind.
Crosshair's whole on-screen history is full of this rejection. Clones as a whole experience a lot of discrimination in-universe.
Because you're inferior.
But on top of that, the Bad Batch is ostracized by other clones.
The Defect Squad's got themselves a new recruit.
All of this builds out a motivation that is very easy to sympathize with, making it easy for people to identify with, or at the very least, like his character. Liking is an especially important motivating factor for those who try to excuse Crosshair's actions on the basis of the inhibitor chip. It's an argument of automatism, which serves to negate the idea of mens rea. Mens rea, Latin for guilty mind, is a concept in the court of law that defines one's culpability in a crime based on their mental state when committing it. Many are familiar with the degrees of murder. Those are based on the idea of mens rea. Intentional murder is very different from accidental manslaughter. Generally, an offense is more severe the more control and intent there is behind it. This is a tradition that goes back hundreds of years and stems from a deep, intuitive understanding of right and wrong present in almost all people. People are generally very good at intuitively determining a mens rea category for a person. It's been shown through research that the legal and psychological concepts map quite well. However, the idea is distorted by a number of factors. Often, if a person knows the outcome of a certain assessment and desires or does not desire it, they will craft logic that reaches or avoids that outcome, such as misclassifying a person's mens rea as intentional rather than knowing, or vice versa. It's been shown that they do the same when the offender in question reflects the evaluator's views. Thus, since as previously established, Crosshair is a character that is very easy to like and identify with, people are subconsciously misclassifying his mens rea as less culpable than it is. This is especially easy since Crosshair exists in a strange gray area for mens rea. Automatism is a recognized state in which the mind has no control over the body, such as when sleepwalking, which voids the mens rea entirely. Inhibitor chips, likewise, are easily classified as automatism. They are absolute mind control. Clones don't have any choice but to execute all Jedi when Order 66 is given, no matter how dear their Jedi were to them. Thus, no one blames Rex or Jesse or Cody for their actions under the Order. However, textual evidence shows that this automatism is generally limited only to Order 66 and the surrounding events. Clones retain a level of agency outside that. Captains Hauser and Gregor, for example, are fully chipped clones, but look at their actions throughout the Bad Batch.
We're now being ordered to target the very people we swore to protect, and I will not be a part of it any longer.
That's Captain Trader.
Furthermore, Crosshair goes well beyond obeying his inhibitor chip. He takes genuine initiative.
Request permission to hunt them down.
It would seem then that an automatism-based argument should be entirely illogical. However, Crosshair is a little more complicated than a standard chipped clone. His chip, while he had it, was deliberately and painfully experimented on to bolster its effects on him. Thus, one could still create a fairly strong argument for automatism, and that gray area leads those who were already psychologically inclined to reduce Crosshair's culpability to ignore the rest of the facts. Then, since it's so massively disruptive to one's intuitive sense of justice to hold someone responsible for actions outside of their control, they excuse his actions. It's also worth noting that Star Wars narratively has established automatism as an exonerating factor several times before, and not only in inhibitor chips. There's Ahsoka, who tried to kill Anakin and Obi-Wan while under the influence of the Sun, the embodiment of the dark side. There's countless droids like IG-11, whose violent acts are forced by their very strict programming. And there's even the Bad Batch's resident cyborg Echo, who was compelled to aid the Separatists by the machines forcibly implanted in him after he was blown up and captured. None of them were considered responsible for their actions, which makes a narrative precedent that makes it all the easier for a viewer to fall into the trap of excusing Crosshair on those same grounds. And if that weren't enough, characters in the show who, in fairness, don't know everything Crosshair did for the Empire, repeat that he shouldn't be blamed for much of the series.
You can't help it.
This isn't you.
This all only further cements this idea in a viewer's mind. There is another, similar defense also used by apologists. Crosshair was just following orders. This is referred to as the superior orders defense in international law. It's also called the Nuremberg defense, after its most famous usage by Nazi officials on trial for their crimes during the Holocaust. The defense was rejected, following orders did not in any way justify amoral actions. It did, however, reveal a few interesting psychological phenomena. That year, psychologist Stanley Milgram performed famous experiments into human obedience and found shocking results. A majority of people, 65% of participants in fact, were willing to inflict what they believed to be agonizingly painful or even potentially lethal shocks to another person when ordered to do so. He found that coercion changed a person's perception of their own agency. They separated their personal actions from the results they cause. Jessica Liang explains another layer to the problem of obedience when applied to a military setting. Soldiers are bound by the extreme discipline inherent to military training. Not only are they taught to unquestioningly trust in their superiors, but they may also face punishment if they fail to comply. She calls this the soldier's dilemma. Elements of this idea are definitely seen and argued in our case example. The Empire is no stranger to executing disobedient officers, and nor was the Grand Army of the Republic. There is definitely a level of threat associated with non-compliance. Furthermore, clones are genetically modified for obedience.
Kaminoans inhibited the cognitive functions of clones to engineer them to follow orders without question.
And then trained to prioritize it above almost anything else. On top of that, they generally lack life experience. The oldest clones are only 13 by the end of the war thanks to accelerated aging, and none of them have ever known a life outside the military. But, to quote the podcast that helped inspire this research,
I really do think it is a matter of being able to hold two things that are true in your heart at the same time.
You can be a victim of a system and also be a perpetrator of violence on behalf of the system.
As established at the Nuremberg trials, obedience is not an excuse for amoral behavior, but it's very easy to reason that it could be. If anyone has the innate capacity to harm others while following orders, as Milgram shows, and the soldier's dilemma only furthers that, it can appear on the surface as a decent excuse, especially when considering the aforementioned tendency to morally disengage and underestimate the mens rea when one likes a character. We've analyzed some of the justifications used by Crosshair fans, but sometimes people don't use any excuse at all. Instead, with a second season on the horizon, they demand a redemption arc, a grand return to the light. Expectations are a fundamental part of how audiences consume media. Every piece that a person has consumed contributes to their expectations as the human brain naturally seeks patterns. A work's genre, its general subject matter, and its specific premise all generate some kind of expectation in a consumer. Star Wars, as a franchise, gets added expectations from all the other in-universe works it has put out. One of these expectations is the redemption arc. From Darth Vader to Kylo Ren to Asajj Ventress to Agent Kallus, we've seen redemptions of all sort play out on screen in basically every Star Wars media ever made. Crosshair, however, isn't a particularly good candidate for redemption. While he may have a spark of good in him, that isn't what makes a redemption arc. He has one aspect, acceptance from other characters,
We still would have taken you.
but he sorely lacks in the most important part, a willingness to repent. See, whereas Darth Vader snapped when Luke was electrocuted, or Agent Kallus questioned his actions when Zeb prompted him to do so, Crosshair was handed a chance to repent on a silver platter and still turned it away.
The Empire will control the entire galaxy, and I am going to be a part of it.
In the end, as Tex says,
It is his nature. You cannot change that. He cannot change that.
but as creator George Lucas himself says, Star Wars is like poetry. It rhymes. That pattern and thus that expectation still remains. In Star Wars, villains, particularly sympathetic ones, get redeemed. Viewers tend to be disappointed or frustrated or just generally displeased with media that fails to address their expectations in some way, whether by adhering to the pattern or subverting it, and The Bad Batch has yet to follow the redemption arc pattern. But with a second season coming, it has the potential to do so, and thus the expectation still stands. And so, people don't even need to rely on their own arguments to believe Crosshair is good. They can simply demand the narrative prove it for them. Thus, as previously explained, they can go on enjoying his character guilt-free. Crosshair is just one of the many, many villains to receive this treatment because ultimately, the excuses people use and the reasoning behind them isn't specific to him at all. As a character who touches a wide variety of ethical topics with a fan base that falls into many moral fallacies, though, he is an interesting one to examine. To review, it's easy to like a villain. Just add a little bit of humanity, a bit of motivation that an audience can relate to, and suddenly viewers can see themselves in even the worst of people. But no one really wants to be that person. It's a massive blow to one's self-image and brings with it a mess of guilt and pain. So people find ways around it through moral disengagement. Some focus on a lack of agency, appealing to our innate sense of justice surrounding guilty intent. Others look to the nature of obedience and the disciplinary training of a soldier. Others yet simply expect characters to find their own way back to the light, as many before them did. In the end, no amount of excuses can redeem a character. Crosshair still chose to hurt many people, and in the end, he's fictional. But fiction reflects reality, and when those same thought patterns get reflected onto real people who hurt others, things can get dangerous. So yes, like villains, I'm going to keep liking Crosshair. At the same time, though, be aware of how you think about them. And of course, may the Force be with you.